recently rewatched Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders was my favorite film as a child and is still solidly in my top 5. I've watched it more times than I can count, and yet I've never really examined its visual style. I should note, however, I view this film with rose-tinted glasses, if you couldn't tell already. It is one of the biggest nostalgia bombs from my childhood, and I can endlessly rewatch it, achieving the same Letterboxd rating every single time. 5 fucking stars, baby. This movie is so goddamn good. I don't know how to explain how fucking good this movie is to me, but it's essentially the perfect film. Take everything I'm about to say with essentially a grain of salt, because I love this movie too much to talk about it in a unbiased way. So, to begin, the bias towards wide anamorphics throughout this film plays a major role in the overall look. Obviously, a film shot on anamorphics is going to look significantly different to one shot on spherical glass. That is entirely the point of anamorphic lenses. They were invented as a tool by the film studios during the early days of television as a reason for people to go to the movie theaters. Even though people could now consume content in their homes, anamorphic lenses essentially stretch the light on its way to contact the film stock and squeeze it. Then, in post, when projecting the film, the image is de-squeezed, in the process creating the letterboxing on the top and bottom of the film. Now, we really only call this letterboxing because modern displays have widely adopted a 16:9 or even taller aspect ratio. So when your screen is the correct size, such as 2:39 anamorphic widescreen, like is created with the Panavision lenses Raiders was shot on, you don't have letterboxing. These Panavision lenses are the OGs. I mean, anamorphics today wish they were the Panavision C series this was shot on. Anamorphic lenses in general just add a nice funk to an image. A product of squeezing more information onto the film stock is, well, more information can hit a viewer's eyes. It is easier to capture way more through anamorphic lenses simply because of the wider aspect ratio. Think about a medium shot on a spherical lens than a medium shot on anamorphic lenses. There's just more in the anamorphics. Obviously, not every film needs more, but this fucking movie, man, it is so good with more. It didn't need more, necessarily, but it's just so fucking good. It just looks so good. Douglas Slocum, the DP, was very intentional with what moments he chose to use longer glass, however. I really love this style of cinematography, and it's something you see with other DPs at the top level, like Deakins. Staying relatively wide does a great job of putting the audience in the film rather than simply observing it. To me, long lenses do a great job of isolating details, or, when used from very far from actors, making the audience feel as though the characters are being watched. They have a distinct observational quality to them, which I really love. In some instances, they can kind of feel like you're looking through binoculars or a telescope. It's essentially the same as what a long lens does. In the back of our mind, when we see an image that is through a long lens, we subconsciously associate it with watching from a distance. But they should not be used all the time. It is a selective use of them in Raiders that makes them all the more effective. Looking at some specific examples of these detailed moments, I think the opening scene is a great example of where a long lens is used effectively. The introduction of Indy to the world for the first time happens through this lovely series of shots, all in relatively long lenses. The whole thing feels like Slocum was on something between like a 50 and a 70, so not terribly long, but a 50 on Super 35 has a pretty long feeling because of compression. Slocum and Spielberg effectively hide Indy's identity while he is almost shot immediately in the film. Then, when Indy steps into the light after he's whipped the gun out of the guy's hand, they're now on a little wider of a lens, probably like a 35. This moment is the first example of this hard noir style lighting taking effect. The hard light through the trees just barely showing in Indy's eyes. Absolutely masterful. Slight side note, I read on IMDb that Slocum didn't use a light meter during the shooting of this film. That's fucking mind-blowing to me, given how incredible and consistent the contrast ratios are. The separation between films like this and modern cinema, where everyone on set can see exactly what is being captured through the monitors, is astronomical. To perfectly expose film, keeping contrast ratios consistent, and being very bold with how dark and bright some parts of this film are, all without a light meter? I can't even begin to comprehend how impressive that is.
We would do it on really widescreen, knowing that we were going to have some fairly large canvases. So that format seemed to be right for them. And he wanted the thing to be very strong looking, but at the same time was happy for me to put in all the shadows I wanted.
This leads to Steven Soderbergh's cut of this film, where he removed all sound and color, quote, apart from a score designed to aid you in your quest to just study the visual staging aspect. This is such a fascinating exercise in examination of blocking and framing, cutting and light. It raises the metaphorical gutters for the viewer to simply absorb all the visual elements of this film, other than, of course, its color. When watching this cut of the film, something fascinating stood out to me. Indy's hat. The hat serves a really funny purpose for the story of these films, with Indy constantly risking his life and limb, literally, to keep his precious hat. But the hat proved to be an interesting tool, or perhaps obstacle, for Douglas to utilize. See, hats cast shadows, and when Slocum is using such an abundance of hard light, they really cast shadows. Personally, when shooting, I've been taught to avoid hats, as they block light coming from the top down, one of the most important directions for light to travel when lighting a face, and subsequently can block a performance. The entire job of a cinematographer is to capture the performance in the best way for the story. So the mere presence of Indy's hat essentially shaped chunks of the cinematography of these films. It had never really occurred to me somehow when watching Raiders in full color, being surrounded by the lovely sound design, how much of an impact the hero hat had on how it was shot. But now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. Every shot, there are essentially two ways that Slocum could go. Show the eyes or hide them in shadow. To show the eyes, he either needed to bounce light up into the face, which creates its own set of potential issues, or blast light from the side of the actor. Both of these are viable options, but what I found most interesting was when Spielberg and Slocum decided not to show part or all of Indy's face and completely or partially hide it in shadow or hide it behind the hat itself. This choice and the choices like this are what film is all about. I've talked about it before, but films are essentially just the product of a series of choices made by everyone working on them. For example, there is a wonderful story from the set of Raiders.
There was so much stress shooting in Tunisia that we just wanted to go home because it was super hot, hard to breathe. You couldn't take a deep breath. Plus, we all began getting sick. I didn't get sick because I subsisted on canned food from the UK, but all the rest of the crew who ate at the restaurants or at the hotels, they all got sick.
I have never been so ill on a film set. I think I actually had cholera.
Originally, it was scripted that Indy would fight the big guy relatively extensively to what actually happens in the movie. We all know Indy shakes his head, draws his gun, and shoots him. This is only because everyone was so sick at the time of shooting that nobody had the energy to actually shoot the full fight. So, they improvised and shortened the scene into a single bullet. This choice by production to not bring in food for the entire crew and to stick to local cuisine, which honestly sounds kind of awesome because I love eating food in different places, but that caused this change in the script. That was not a creative decision being made. That was a purely logistical decision, and it should not have really impacted the final film, but it did. One might think that the decisions of PAs and other below-the-line positions on set don't really impact the final product. This is such a great example of how it really does. It's like every single person who works on a film has their little finger on the pulse of that film. And if they choose to pinch, they can change the outcome. Crazy.
Bad dates.
Enough ADHD rambling. Let's get back to the topic of the hat and hard light. This technique reminds me heavily of many American noir films where characters wore similar fedoras. These were used as tools of the directors and cinematographers of those days, and Slocum and Spielberg definitely drew influence from them. It also gave Harrison Ford another tool in his belt to utilize bringing Indy to life. Another tool available to Ford and his fellow cast members were their eyes. In conjunction with Slocum, there is a lovely bias of the eyes of the performers. There are many moments which exemplify this, but one of my favorites is when Indy is by the door of Marion's bar, and the hard light can be seen filtering through the cracks of the door. One beam lands perfectly, illuminating Indy's right eye as he looks back into the bar before he leaves. This is one of those moments I feel couldn't have been planned for ahead of time, but rather was discovered on the day. This brings on the topic of decisions once again. Slocum didn't have to shoot this specific shot this way, but he did, and now I'm here talking about it. Soderbergh mentions it on his blog when he posted his Raiders cut. He quotes Fincher saying, "There's potentially 100 different ways to shoot something, but at the end of the day, there's really only 2. And one of them is wrong." Slocum chooses the correct choice over and over again while shooting Raiders. It's insane. There's an additional moment during the bar scene that I really love the look of. When Ronald Lacey's character, Major Arnold Todt, holds a glowing fire poker in front of Marion's eyes, the warm glow of the poker reminds me of another lovely aspect of the cinematography, being the color. Most of the film takes place in warm climates, and the entire film has this warm, nostalgic glow of Kodak 5247, the only 35mm Kodak color negative made at the time of filming. The idea of the Mexico effect in film is not present here. The overwarming of film and TV when one is in a warm climate. This film, while it may feel warm, has an entirely different quality. This quality is present in every piece of media from this time, partially because of the lack of other options in film stock. But with or without color, this film is a masterpiece. Moving to another technical aspect I admire about this film is the frequent use of deep focus. Contrary to shallow depth of field, something I find to be extremely desirable among people getting started in cinematography because of its association with the quote, cinematic look, which pisses me the fuck off, and I've talked about that before and I'm not gonna get it fucking into it, okay? A deep focus, in my opinion, takes a lot more skill to achieve. Deep focus is achieved by closing a lens down as far as you can, causing the focus plane to get deeper, which means one can have actors, props, etc. throughout the frame all be in focus at the same time. This technique was sort of made famous by Citizen Kane back in the day. Additionally, thinking back to this era, film stocks were not even close to as sensitive to light as modern digital sensors are. Imagine limiting yourself to shooting everything on your little digital mirrorless camera, but being restricted to 50 ISO. How would you feel? Now, close your lens down entirely. Not a great exposure, I would imagine, unless you are outside in harsh sunlight. Now, put yourself in a world before LED film lights. To get enough light to shoot with a deep focus on relatively slow film stock with huge hot lights, just an insane process which contributes immensely to the vibe of the final product. Okay, taking what you know now and apply it to what you see in Raiders. Slocum and Spielberg intentionally used deep focus for huge portions of this movie to simply capture the grandeur and action happening in each frame. This film won 4 Academy Awards for Best Art Direction, Set Direction, Best Sound, Best Film Editing, and Best Visual Effects. It was nominated for Best Cinematography, but it was beat out by the film Reds, shot by Vittorio Storaro.
Thank you very much.
Regardless, what a great example of film as a collaborative medium. Raiders wins Best Set Direction.
The winners are Norman Reynolds and Leslie Dilley for Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I would be willing to bet a lot of money that if Slocum hadn't shot a lot of this film with deep focus, that probably wouldn't have happened. Why? Because you wouldn't be able to see it. This trend of throwing every lens wide open and shooting these blurry messes is cool and all, but I have such an appreciation for the craft and artfulness of closing down and showing everything. It lets light shine, lets set deck shine, lets actors perform without insane marks they need to hit, so the poor first AC sweating in the corner doesn't need to hit their insane marks as precisely. This being said, I don't think a shallow depth of field never works. Look at the White Lotus, for example. While some of the shots, I think they went a little too shallow, where they almost feel like green screen. You look at most of that show, and I think they use depth of field excellently as a tool to tell that story. I'm simply stating my appreciation for how a deep focus is used to tell this story. Combining all of these techniques, you get this beautiful gem of a film. A true nostalgia bomb for me, and I'm sure many others, and a lovely example of film as a medium. If you also love this movie, consider subscribing, liking, and commenting on this video because it helps out a ton. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Okay, bye-bye.